Studebaker, Packard, Nash, and Hudson.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome. Are any of you here in town just for the car show? No, you're all locals or at least semi-locals, and so I hope that maybe you'll attend the car show tomorrow. It sounds interesting. Tim asked me to just tell you a little bit about my background. I'm a board member of the MotorCities National Heritage Area, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and a past board member of the Henry Ford Heritage Association and a member of the Northville Historic Society. So I've been having a lot of fun with history lately. So let's get right into the car companies. These are 4 car companies that were big names, but they didn't quite make it into the big 3. They became household names. You know, at one time there were over 500 automobile companies in the U.S. in the 20s. And just think, the big 3 rose above all of that. So these are the 4 that didn't quite make it, but they had to be pretty good to be in the next tier. They survived longer than most. So how did they start? How successful were they? And why'd they disappear? So let's find out more about these automotive pioneers, the Studebaker Brothers, the Packard Brothers, Charlie Nash, and Joseph L. Hudson. In 1990, they supplied a carriage for President William McKinley to use at his home in Ohio. Studebaker became one of the major buggy manufacturers in the country. They had the largest wagon plant in the world in South Bend, Indiana. Well, here's one that some of you are familiar with, the Budweiser beer wagons. These were used to deliver beer in the early 1900s. Later, in 1933, they began being used with the famous Clydesdale horses to advertise Budweiser. So Studebaker got into the automobile business in 1902 when they introduced a line of electric cars. Due to the short distances they could travel, electric cars soon were being upstaged by the more versatile gasoline-powered cars. And of course now we're swinging around and they found ways to increase the distance of the electric cars. I'm still a little uneasy about just being out there on batteries. I like the one that has a small engine too, so that if your battery dies, you can get further. But you know, certainly it's coming in some way. So they got started in the electric cars. So in 1904, they introduced a gasoline-powered automobile in partnership with the Garford Company of Cleveland, Ohio. Garford made the chassis and engine, and Studebaker made the body. This is a 1908 limousine. President William Howard Taft, in office from 1909 to 1913, had the first presidential automobile fleet. His white steam car, a Baker Electric, and 2 Pierce Arrows are shown. He loved to travel by automobile to promote the industry. Pierce Arrow was later acquired by Studebaker. Studebaker then partnered with another company in Detroit, EMF. They also added more Studebaker models and then standardized their lineup in 1914 with 2 models, the 4 and the 6. 1918, they introduced a brand new line of cars designed by 3 brilliant engineers, Owen Skelton, Fred Zader, and Carl Breer. They were the same engineers who later designed Walter Chrysler's first namesake car in 1925. Chrysler referred to them as the 3 Musketeers because they worked so well as a team. The Studebaker Phaeton was an example of the beautiful cars they designed. Here's an interesting picture I ran across. This is a Studebaker being serviced. No hydraulic hoist, and you got to have a lot of confidence in those racks holding it up, don't you? But that's the way they used to do it. Well, everything didn't work out right for them. In 1927, they introduced a line called the Dictator. The idea was to connote the model that would dictate the standard that other companies would have to follow. Well, as you know, in 1937, a dictator named Adolf Hitler came along on the scene, and the name was dropped. They introduced another new line in 1927 called the Erskine, after the president of the company, Albert Erskine, who would become president in 1915. This was intended to compete with the lower-priced market, but at $945, it was twice the price of a Model T and a third higher than the Chevrolet. It did not sell well. They introduced the President line in 1928. This is a 1932 President, St. Regis Brougham, that was a limited edition. It had an 8-cylinder engine and developed 122 horsepower. I took this picture at the Concours d'Elegance in Plymouth. How many of you have been there? That is a wonderful show. You see the most beautiful cars in the world. It's I think the last Sunday in July each year. Is it June or July? In July. And I used to say for $25 you could see all these cars. I think it's up to 35 or 40, but it's well worth it. At St. John's. In 1928, Studebaker purchased a large interest in Pierce Arrow under the direction of Albert Erskine. This gave them a luxury car line. They were beautiful cars, and they doubled their sales in 1929 by selling over 10,000 units. 1929. Timing was bad for luxury cars. So as you know, that was the year that the market crashed. Drastically reduced the market for cars. A sign on this car reads, $100 will buy this car. Lost all in the stock market. So Studebaker board members thought things would bounce back fast, and they kept paying dividends to stockholders. Finally, in 1933, they were out of money and forced to declare bankruptcy. Sadly, Albert Erskine committed suicide on the Studebaker proving ground, feeling that he had let the company and the stockholders down. Well, they finally came out of bankruptcy, and in 1939, the Studebaker champion finally gave him a car competitive with Ford, Chevrolet, and Plymouth models in the low price category. Basically put him back in business. They followed up in 1942 with the new Commander and President series. They also made trucks and aircraft engines for World War II effort. They developed a tracked personnel carrier called the WEASEL. Studebaker had a strong position in the commercial truck business with vehicles such as this 1948 truck. A lot of you may remember this car, a 50 Studebaker Starlight. It had a wraparound rear window, and particularly when it was parked in a parking spot, people would walk by and they'd do a double take, and they'd say, they parked on the wrong side of the road, you know? And it's because you could hardly tell the windshield from the back wraparound window. In 1950, they restyled the grille of the Champion model into an aircraft look, sometimes called the bullet nose. I keep running into things, and people keep giving me things to add to my presentation. So one of my earlier presentations, a fellow gave me some information that I've incorporated. This was a Detroit Studebaker dealership on Greenfield Avenue. It was independently owned automotive dealerships were a key part of the automotive industry's operations. They provided a good living for hundreds of families across the country. You know, we think about the impact of the manufacturing companies on employment, but stop and think. I live in Northville. At one time, I think there were 4 automotive dealers in the small town in Northville. Some of you remember, every small or medium-sized town had 2, 3, 4 auto dealers, and they all employed people. So, you know, the dealership network is a big employer. This was the dealership showroom. And there's a proud owner, Carl MAGNEE on the right, being congratulated, I think, by somebody from the company. This shows the parts counter. Again, some of you that have been in the older dealerships, this looks very familiar, doesn't it? And that's in the day when you'd go in and get parts and you could actually repair your own cars because you didn't need all the special tools, and you could actually find the spark plugs and find the air cleaner and all that stuff. Change the oil. Now, they manufacture them in a way that's very hard to do that for most of us.
I believe that tall person right there is Fred Zeter, who was head of engineering for Chrysler.
Oh,
I worked there at the time.
okay. So is that one of the 3 Musketeers?
Yes.
Yeah. How about that? Thank you. Thank you. See, I learn something every time. That's wonderful. There is the service department. You notice we have a hydraulic hoist now, a little bit safer. Well, in 1954, they merged with Packard. Both companies were in financial trouble. The merger made them the 4th largest company behind GM, Ford, and Chrysler. They come out with a new Commander, designed in 1954. 1957, they came out with the Golden Hawk, one of the most beautiful cars. A gentleman has one parked out front. Lev Linkner brought his car. What is it, Lev? Which? It's a 56 Skyhawk. So this is a Golden Hawk. But anyway, if it'll probably be out there when you leave if you didn't see it coming in. And it's a beautiful car. I saw it drive by and I thought, I wonder if he's on the way to my presentation. They entered the compact market in 1958 with the new LARK under company president Harold Churchill, and it was a rousing success. It also had a convertible model. In 1963, they introduced a revolutionary design, the AVANTI. Unfortunately, it was too revolutionary in design to be widely accepted by the public. And I kind of draw an analogy to something that happened at Chrysler. This was a Chrysler Airflow, which Walter Chrysler designed because he was a former locomotive guy, and the locomotives were streamlining, and he thought, I'll pull this streamlining into the car design. And again, it wasn't accepted. So they redesigned it, renamed it from Airflow to Airstream, made it more conventional looking, and it sold. So it's a tough industry. You have to be ahead, but if you get too far ahead, people won't take a chance on it. And so that's what happened with the Avanti. Well, the Studebaker Packard Company continued to struggle financially. In 1963, the South Bend plant was closed, and all manufacturing was done in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And in 1966, the last Studebakers were produced there, and the company was gone. How many of you have been to the National Studebaker Museum? Anybody? It's a wonderful museum. You know, you need to spend a fair amount of time there. It's in South Bend, Indiana, and it includes exhibits of their carriages and cars, and so it's a wonderful museum. Just don't go there on a football weekend when Notre Dame is playing because of the traffic. Okay, let's look at the origins of Packard. Anybody ever had a Packard? Or have a Packard now? No Packards, okay. We got a lot of brothers involved in the industry. Packard was founded by James Ward Packard and his brother William Dowd Packard and an investor, George Lewis Weiss. James was a mechanical engineer, and he believed they could build a better car than the Winton cars owned by Weiss, who was also a stockholder in Winton. They didn't care in those days. You could invest in several companies, and there was no conflict of interest. They didn't worry about it. Winton cars, you may, if that sounds familiar, they were ones that Henry Ford beat in a race in Detroit, which made his name in the auto industry and led him to getting support to start his company. Anyway, in 1900, the Ohio Automobile Company was founded in Warren, Ohio, to build Packard brand cars. In 1902, they changed the name of the company to the Packard Motor Car Company. Their first models had one-cylinder engines and a tiller-type steering wheel. But in 1901, they changed it to a steering wheel, the industry's first. In 1903, they changed to a big two-cylinder engine. Well, as you probably know, in 1903, they built a huge plant in Detroit designed by Albert Kahn, the same architect who designed Ford's plants. We'll talk more about that later. So Packard concentrated on cars starting at $2,600, while Fords and Oldsmobiles were selling for well under $1,000. James Alvin Macaulay was president from 1916 until 1929. Got his picture on the cover of Time magazine. He created the slogan, "Ask the man who owns one." Yes?
Yeah, the building may still be there.
It is. In fact, we'll talk about that. They're refurbishing it, believe it or not. Thank you. So they created beautiful, luxurious, and powerful automobiles, such as this 1916 Packard twin-six touring car with a 12-cylinder engine. The V-type engine was cast in two separate six-cylinder blocks and produced 88 horsepower. Packard even made fire trucks. And I'm not completely sure, but I think Henry Ford went to his gravesite in a Packard hearse. In 1929, PHAETON was one of their most beautiful designs. So Packard became a prestige car, was a top-selling luxury brand between 1924 and 1930. They offered an incredible number of body variations, some produced by bodybuilders, such as Dietrich and Brewster. Packards were owned by the world over by royalty. In 1931, 10 Packards were owned by Japan's royal family. Packard engines were used in speedboats. Gar Wood's Miss America 10 had a 4 12-cylinder, 1,800 horsepower engines. Set a world record in 1932 of 124 miles an hour, the first time a boat went faster than 2 miles a minute. This 33 Packard convertible Victoria has aluminum doors to lessen the weight and provide for the large opening. Cost $2,780 when new. Isn't that beautiful? This is an unrestored 1934 Super 8 Sport Phaeton, shown again, and this was in 2014 at the Concourse d'Elegance in Plymouth. It has 61,000 original miles. Original paint, yep, unrestored. This one only has, there were only 19 of this model produced in 1934. In the 40s, they continued their outstanding styling with this 41 convertible coupe. Notice the headlights were now embedded in the fenders. In the 40s, they continued to lead the luxury market with this 42 Clipper touring sedan. During World War II, they manufactured engines for PT boats. These torpedo boats had multiple engines and could reach 45 miles an hour. This is John F. Kennedy was injured when his PT-104 was cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. They also made aircraft engines for the P-51 fighter planes, which would protect bomber squadrons in their missions. The streamlined Super 8 Club sedan had a powerful 8-cylinder engine and helped to make 1948 their best year since the 20s. Notice the fender skirts over the rear wheels. You had to take those, I think they were skirts and not the body. You had to take those off to change the tire. They also developed a stylish 48 station wagon. They continued to lead in styling as they moved into the 50s, but their profitability was slipping. Dorothy Draper was a well-known interior designer. So in 1952, they had her design the interior of this model, publicized her name with the car. Incidentally, her husband had been physician to Franklin Delano Roosevelt since he contracted polio. So, as we talked earlier, in 1954, they were in financial trouble and merged with another financially plagued company, Studebaker. Unfortunately, their styling began to blend in with many other company models. The last Packard cars were produced in 1958. Now here we come to the original. There's the original Packard plant today. Sits idle and dilapidated in Detroit. It's been purchased by an investor who plans to restore it for commercial and residential use. He is Fernando Pleirelo, a native of Spain who lives in Lima, Peru, and has done this at other places in the world. And they all already have, I guess, one business in there already. It's going to be a long, long haul, but they're started, so it's almost unbelievable. Also, the Packard name was purchased, and a new Packard model with a 12-cylinder engine has been developed. I went on the website recently, and I can't seem to find much new. I don't know if it's stalled or dead, but whatever this new Packard was hasn't gone anywhere right now. Some of you might have heard of Margaret Dunning of Plymouth. She caught the attention of Ripley's editors after the Detroit News, saluting her many contributions to Plymouth, named her 2013 Michiganian of the Year. She's shown here in her beloved 1930 Packard 740 Custom 8. I just love that car, she said. She was recognized by Ripley's Believe It or Not. Why? Because of her nearly a century of driving? Yes, she was 104. Well, I'm hanging in there if I can, she said. Life has been wonderful. She attended one of my sessions in Royal Oak, and a woman with her said something, and I kind of thought I recognized her, and mentioned her friend a couple times, And so I said, is your friend Margaret Dunning? And she said, yes. And I said, Margaret, you know, do you, because I knew she didn't mind, do you mind telling us what your age is? And I think she was 102 at that time, or 104, I don't know. Anyway, and I said, well, did you drive to the sessions today? And she said, oh, no, I just drove to my friend's house and she drove here. Unfortunately, she passed away a year or two ago. She was at a car show in California showing her car. The story is she was going down some steps, somebody bumped her and she fell and did not recover. So another little story, my wife grew up in Plymouth, and so we were sorting through some things, and she had a 1929 yearbook that was her dad's yearbook in Plymouth. So I said, well, why don't we give it to the Plymouth Historical Museum, which was founded by Margaret Dunning? And so she said, sure. So I took it in, and I'm talking to the librarian, and she said, oh, Margaret's here today. Let me tell her that you're donating this. So I came over, and she said, oh, 1929. That was my year of graduation. Well, I made a faux pas. I said, oh, let's see. So I said, well, my wife's father, you know, was in the yearbook, and Don Herrick, or Mike Herrick, Don was her uncle, Mike Herrick, and she said, oh, he was a handsome guy. And so I said, well, let's see if we can find your picture. What was your maiden name? She said, Dunning. So, you know, it's never married. So, anyway, she was quite a lady. Then at one of my presentations, I mentioned that somebody told me that she stopped changing her own oil when she hit about 101 and had somebody else do it. And so after the presentation, a fellow came up and said, yeah, I was the guy that took over changing her oil. And he said, but she would still stand above me and look down, make sure I was doing it right. Okay, so let's look at how Nash Motors got started. Well, Charlie Nash had risen to president of General Motors in 1912, been let go in 1916 when GM founder Billy Durant returned to the presidency after being eased out 6 years earlier, and that's quite a story. The Billy Durant story is a fun one that I do. Anyway, so Charlie Nash didn't have a job anymore. Billy Durant was president, so he took over the Thomas Jeffrey Company in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and named it after himself, Charlie Motors, right? Okay, at least I got a smile. So that's how Nash Motors got started. Nash tried to recruit a top talent from General Motors named Walter Chrysler to go with him. But Chrysler stayed at GM. He said that he was going to follow Nash to Wisconsin, and Durant offered him $500,000 a year to stay on at GM as president of Buick for 3 years, with the provision that he Durant not interfere with Nash's decisions. Well, Durant couldn't do that. He delegated, but he would second guess people. So when the end of the 3 years came, Walter left with several $1 million that he had gotten from selling his stock to Billy Durant, and started his own company eventually. He took a couple jobs in between, then started his own company. Anyway, so when Nash went over to Wisconsin and took over the company there, Thomas Jeffrey Company, then he changed the name to Nash Motors, and his slogan was, give the customer more than he had paid for. This is interesting. The Thomas Jeffrey Company began making automobiles in 1902, before Chrysler got there, and they had a Rambler model. It became one of the top 20 automobile manufacturers by 1916, the Thomas Jeffrey Company. So later on, when Nash had the Nash Rambler, why they went back and picked up the name from one of the Jeffrey Company models. James Starrow was a banker, was the former president of GM, bought the Jeffrey Company And he became chairman. He's the one that brought in Charles Nash as president in 1916. They added the Nash nameplate in 1917, came out with the first actual Nash model in 1918, as shown here. In 1918, they got a big contract for military trucks and also developed a commercial division. Isn't that a beauty? Nash used their military truck experience to develop a line of commercial trucks. This 1925 Nash was one of their early models. Well, Nash wanted to retire, and he was looking for somebody to back him up. So a fellow named George Mason was CEO of Kelvinator Corporation, a major manufacturer of refrigerators. And he was courted by Nash to take over as president of Nash Motors. He was recommended by Walter Chrysler. They had worked together at General Motors. But Mason agreed only if Nash would purchase Kelvinator. He didn't want to give it up. So Nash said, okay. So he agreed in 1937, the Nash Kelvinator Corporation was formed. Nash was the first company to provide flow-through ventilation aided by a fan, and refrigeration was later added, surprise, to create the first air conditioning feature for automobiles. They developed a convertible version of their large Ambassador model in 1948. And again, I mentioned the Rambler. The Nash Rambler was introduced mid-year in 1950. It was an immediate hit because of its price, fuel economy, and a peppy six-cylinder engine. They also had a station wagon and convertibles. Station wagons, of course, were very popular with families. The 1951 Nash Statesman was a popular luxury vehicle. So let me ask you this, a bit of trivia. What was the first American sports car? What do you think of right away? Go ahead. Corvette, that's what most people think of. It was a 1951 Nash Healey. It had a Nash Ambassador powertrain, aluminum body designed by Donald Healey Motors of Britain. It was first manufactured in England, but later made in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and made before the Corvette. Well, in 1955, Nash manufactured a small car called the Nash Metropolitan, designed for short trips in the city. Well, they had a convertible model. I'm the skinny guy there in the driver's seat, and my dad is on the other side. We're down in Florida. This was the first convertible I had driven. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I mean, it was a tiny little thing with hardly any horsepower, but it was a convertible. I've had convertibles ever since. Okay, what about Hudson Motor Company? J.L. Hudson, founder of Detroit's department store in 1981 in Detroit, provided the financing for the Hudson Motor Car Company, and that was named in his honor. Yeah.
Was that originally a part of Ford Motor Company?
What?
Was Hudson?
No. No. No, it was started from scratch. The actual leader of the company was Roy Chapin, who helped found the company in 1908. After building the company, he left in 1932 to become Secretary of Commerce under Herbert Hoover. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt beat Hoover for the presidency, later that year, Chapin returned to Hudson after only 6 months in Washington. Pretty lucky when you think about it. His grandson, Bill Chapin, is currently president of the Automotive Hall of Fame in Dearborn. You ever been to the Automotive Hall of Fame? It's right near the Henry Ford Museum. It's down at the end of the parking lot. A lot of people miss it, but it focuses more on the individuals, the pioneers, than it does the cars. And Roy Chapin is president of that. They are announced they're going to move the museum to Detroit because it gets too confused with the Henry Ford Museum and the Greenfield Village and so forth. So they're planning on moving it to Detroit within a couple of years. So the first major model was a 1909 Model 20, a four-cylinder car which sold for $995. They built 4,556 of these, in 1909. This is displayed right down the road here at the Ypsilanti Automotive Heritage Museum, which is a nice little museum. I put some literature out there that they gave me, and they also gave me the shirt. So you can buy them there. But it's a nice little museum, and I would highly recommend it. It used to be a dealership. How many of you have been there? Oh, quite a few of you. Okay, good, good. 1916, they developed a six-cylinder engine with a balanced crankshaft, which increased its power. They called it the Super 6 engine, and it was very popular with customers. A new lower-priced line, the Essex, was introduced in 1920 to compete with Ford and Chevrolet. Found great success, and by 1925, it had helped Hudson move to third place in sales behind Ford and Chevrolet. Their success continued with this 1929 Hudson Landau model. They added the sporty 1929 Hudson Roadster with a six-cylinder engine. The total Hudson production in 1929 was over 300,000 cars, continuing their position as third in the industry. This is again at the museum in Ypsi. In 1933, Hudson began phasing out its Essex nameplate for the modern Terraplane brand name. Everything was going aircraft oriented. It was launched with a promotional christening by Amelia Earhart. I love this picture. In 1934, they came out with a sporty Hudson 8 convertible coupe. Notice the helmets. I mean, if you're going to ride in a convertible, you had to have a leather helmet. I love that. They had a 1948 Commodore convertible. Their designs became more streamlined. One of their iconic cars was a streamlined 1949 Commodore sedan. And again, this is at the museum down the street. The Hudson Hornet was used as a NASCAR racer. It had an inline six-cylinder engine with twin carburetors and generated 170 horsepower. These cars won 79 NASCAR races and inspired the Doc Hudson car in the Cars animated movie. So now you got some trivia for your kids or grandkids. Well, Hudson was purchased by Nash in 1954, and American Motors was formed from the two companies. Henry Ford II was dumping cars on the market at a loss to overtake GM to become number one in the auto industry. George Mason tried to bring Studebaker and Packard into AMC, but James Nance of Packard wanted to be president. He would only come in if they made him president, and they wouldn't. So then that's when Packard then merged with Studebakers. So instead of all four companies coming together, they had two and two. Many people thought if all four companies had joined together in AMC, it would have been second to GM in the industry with a much better future. You may recognize this fella. Within a year, George Romney, future governor of Michigan, took over as president of AMC when Mason died. Romney had been an executive at Nash Calvinator. He had a son born in Detroit that you might have heard of, Mitt Romney. They produced a Hudson version of the Nash Metropolitan. So this is the Hudson Metropolitan. The 1957 Hornet was the last year of the Hudson brand. The AMC brand was used then for all models after that. So many of you may remember the Rambler. George Romney had focused all efforts at AMC on the compact Rambler. And by 1960, it was the third most popular brand behind Ford and Chevrolet. They also continued the Ambassador line of large cars. They added sporty cars like the AMX and the Javelin. And they acquired the Jeep operations in Toledo, Ohio from the Kaiser Company in 1970. And that was a real big move, as we'll see later. Anybody remember the Pacer? They created a novel model of Pacer which had large curved windows, attracted a lot of attention, but not a lot of sales. I worked for a guy that had one of those, and the air conditioning wasn't that great, and the windows were very ample, and so it was warm in there. And he thought he was buying a car with good mileage, and it wasn't really that great in terms of mileage. So they created an economy car, the Gremlin. Had a six-cylinder engine and a lightweight body and could really move. We bought our daughter graduated from high school in 1988, and we bought a 76 Gremlin for her. And interesting story, we wanted to get a used car for her, and we didn't want to spend a lot of money. She was going to go to Western Michigan. So in those days, we used to look in the newspaper rather than online for things. Looked in the newspaper and saw this 76 Gremlin listed with 14,000 miles. This was in 88. So my wife and I were on our way to play tennis, and I said, I'm going to call on this. This is a misprint. So I called him up, and I said, I'm calling on your Gremlin, yeah. I said, that's obviously a misprint. It's 140,000 miles, right? They said, no, it's 14,000 miles. It was Grandma's car. And Grandpa had a car dealership, and this was Grandma's car. So we started out for tennis, played tennis, and I said on the way home, you know, that thing's not going to last very long because somebody else is going to figure it out. And so we stopped and bought it on the way home, and she drove it for a couple of years to Western. And it really went. I found later it went faster than I had hoped that she would drive it. She kept talking about making it from Northville to Kalamazoo in under 2 hours, and I thought, I've never made it in 2 hours. Eagle was another popular line. It had standard four-wheel drive. Well, profits were down, and the French automaker Renault had entered into a partnership with AMC. By 1983, they had acquired a major ownership, essentially ending AMC's life as an American company. Renault ran into financial problems, laid off thousands of French workers. Renault's chairman, Georges Bessy, was assassinated in 1986 by a dissident group over the layoffs. They don't mess around over there, boy, if you have a layoff. So Renault needed to downsize, sold the AMC operations to Chrysler. The big gain for Chrysler in the long run, again, was the acquisition of the Jeep operations, which is a big part of their operations today. So they came into the Jeep by way of AMC. So why didn't these large companies survive? Well, it was quite complicated, but some of the major factors were these. First of all, it's difficult to compete with the big three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler. They had surged ahead early, had economies of scale, kept their costs down. Products had to be excellent, had to change with the times. There was no room for poor product decisions. Ford, GM, Chrysler could once in a while come out, you know, with an Edsel or something like that and survive. But these other companies did not have enough cash to do that. So they had to be very careful, and again, any poor decisions hurt them. Financing was difficult to obtain through any years of low sales. Leadership had to be outstanding, not just excellent. You had to be as good as Henry Ford, Walter Chrysler, and Billy Durant, and Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors. So these companies made good products, had good sales at times, but somehow did not quite survive the strong competition in the long run. Here's some of the other programs I put on. Henry Ford, his company in his life. Billy Durant, founder of GM, Walter Chrysler, Dodge Brothers, Wright Brothers. Well, I kind of ran out of car companies, and so I had worked for Boeing for 3 years a while back, and so I had heard a few inside stories that were interesting, so I put together one called the Wright Brothers, Bill Boeing and Donald Douglas. They put America in the air. It's the history of the commercial aircraft industry in America. Then we have some where we feature actors portraying people. The big three in 1925, we have Ford, Durant, and Chrysler. Henry and Friends, we have Ford, Edison, and Firestone. And my whole thrust really has been leadership as I look back on my career. And so got involved in what other leaders can get involved with. So we have Franklin Eleanor Roosevelt, Joe and Rose Kennedy, and Harry and Bess Truman. They interact with people in a question and answer period. And I'll give you a secret, we pass out the questions, because otherwise you get off the wall. But we interact, pretend they're their questions, and it was a lot of fun. There's one of the examples of our Henry and Friends. Thomas Edison on the left bears a strange resemblance to me. Henry Ford in the middle, and Harvey Firestone on the right. You are aware that that's taken in the garden at the Fairlane Estate. We did an outdoor performance one year for I wanted to mention the MotorCities National Heritage Area. That's a great website. It's easy to remember, motorcities.org. It's a part of the National Park Service, and it's headquartered in Detroit with a charter to keep automotive history alive throughout Michigan. And if you see these signs, I live in Northville, and there's one in front of the water wheel. The Ford valve plant there has a big water wheel, and there's a sign about this big, and it talks about that. And you'll see those all around the area. I'm sure they have one down at the museum in Ypsi, and at the fire. I think there's one at the Firehouse Museum in Ypsi, and they talk about these historic. And probably in December, if you drive from Chicago on I-94, you're going to see a big sign that says you are now entering the MotorCities National Heritage Area. So it's kind of a cool thing. Unfortunately, President Trump cut all the national heritage areas out of his budget. There are national heritage areas all over the country for different things other than automobiles. So if you think history is important, get a hold of your congressman or senator and see if they can get that back in the budget. I have a website at the bottom, doreproductions.weebly.com, and I post a schedule of my presentations around the area. So if you're interested in finding me sometime where I'm presenting, I usually do a couple of these a month, different places, libraries, senior centers, and you're welcome to follow along and come. So again, thank you for your interest, and we have some. Thank you.
This program was recorded on July 12th, 2018 at the Ann Arbor District Library.